Hello, listeners. Welcome back to another episode of Cognitive Dissidence. As usual, I'm your host. I'm Jacob Shapiro. I'm a partner and the director of geopolitical analysis at Cognitive Investments. Joining me, he hasn't been on for a couple months. It's nice to welcome back cousin Marko Papic, who is a partner and chief strategist at Clock Tower Group. We do our usual around-the-world analysis, everything from the Chinese spy balloon to the future of India's economy to, of course, some very trenchant insights into the Kyrie Irving trade to the Dallas Mavericks. As always, listeners, you can write to me at jacob@cognitive.investments if you have any thoughts or questions about this podcast. Cheers, and see you out there. Cognitive Investments LLC is a registered investment advisor. Advisory services are only offered to clients or prospective clients where Cognitive and its representatives are properly licensed or exempt from licensure. For additional information, please visit our website at www.cognitive.investments. The information provided is for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute investment advice, and it should not be relied on as such. It should not be considered a solicitation to buy or an offer to sell a security. It does not take into account any investor's particular investment objectives, strategies, tax status, or investment horizon. You should consult your attorney or tax advisor. All right, our favorite nihilist heathen is back on the podcast. What's up, cousin Marko?
What's up, cousin Jacob? Good to see you, man.
Good to see you too. I literally just recorded a 15-minute rant about the spy balloon gate, but I guess we should give the people what they want. Do you want to give them your hot, steamy take about the Chinese spy balloon before we get into what's actually going on in the world?
I mean, I'm shocked and surprised and somewhat disappointed we're not leading with Kyrie going to the Mavs.
Oh well, we saved the most important thing for last. We will get to Kyrie.
That was the biggest geopolitical tectonic shift. Look, this balloon thing is, I mean, there's so many takes out there. Mine is not unique in any way. I don't know what you recorded for 15 minutes, but I suspect it's very similar to what I'm going to say, which is that, look, this is much more a reflection of the U.S. than of anything else. Now, you know, Sebastian Mallaby, good friend of mine, great writer, great journalist, just wrote an op-ed saying that it's actually a mirror to China and how, clumsy they are in many ways, in terms of foreign policy, in terms of spycraft and so on. And fine, let's leave that aside. But then that even places more onus on us to criticize the U.S. Because taking the most expensive fighter jet ever built and flying it to pop a balloon, is just, again, this is very interesting to me. And I think it just illustrates how toxic foreign policy related to China has become domestically. Let's lay out some facts. I mean, Chinese spy balloons have overflown the U.S. in the past, not as dramatically as this, to be fair. And I'm not just parroting the Biden administration point, which, by the way, is hilarious. They came out and they're basically making that point as a child, saying, well, she used to do it too. It's like my kids when they fight. Well, my sister does it too. So that's basically what the Biden administration is doing, accusing the Trump administration of basically being asleep at the wheel. And then on top of that, there is a Politico article just sitting out there that you can Google from July of 2022 saying that the Pentagon is ramping up a spy balloon program of its own and will use it against Russia and China, publicly stated. So the hysteria that emerged in the U.S. over this incident, as if, woe is me, the U.S. is the only country that has, high altitude balloons flying over its territory, is just really a symbol of how toxic China is. And I think it's toxic really for two reasons. One, there's this latent post-COVID, anti-China sentiment, not just in the U.S., but everywhere else. You can see this in the polling.
Yep.
Global polling shows that after COVID, a lot of countries have had a turn towards negative towards China. The second, of course, is China is a peer competitor, which is a fact, true. But the third issue, I think, is also that you have a Democrat in charge of the United States of America. I hate to be political, and I'm not. I'm analytical, but this is an objective fact. Democrats don't have maneuvering room to be rational in foreign policy. They just don't. They get eviscerated domestically if they do the rational thing, which is send the Secretary of State to China. Republicans get the maneuvering room to be rational because they're perceived as tough. So Donald Trump is allowed to call Kim Jong-un a very impressive young man. But if Obama had done that, I mean, God forbid, it would have been chaos. And so that's, I think, what's coloring this. The Biden administration is so paranoid about how they're going to be perceived that they cannot function at all rationally when it comes to China and China policies. And I think, ironically, the U.S.-China relationship can really only get better two ways. One, if China cools it with some of the assertiveness, which they sort of have done. And two, if a Republican is in charge of the White House. There's no other way to actually get a coherent dialogue between the two anymore. So if 2024, even someone like Mike Pompeo, who's a huge critic of China, were to get elected president of the United States of America, I would say like, wow, there's a turnaround coming. That's my hot take.
Yeah, I mean, there's historical precedent for this too, and you're right that it's not just you're not being political. You're also being historical. Like the democratic issue with China goes all the way back to Truman and the Korean War. So Truman misses the Korea thing. He says they're not going to defend Korea. Then they decide they're going to defend Korea. Then he gets into a war with China. And part of the reason that the Democrats supported Vietnam to the hilt was because they were afraid that China was going to take over, and they felt they had been soft on China from one sense before, and now they needed to be kind of really anti-China in the Vietnam War. And so it just kind of continues onwards. And it was Nixon, the most, red scare, red baiting, frothing at the mouth, China's an enemy, who was the one who actually went and hung out with Mao and decided, hey, we're just going to give up Taiwan and recognize the Chinese because we have all these issues with the Soviets and we need to fight them too. So I think you're right there. The difference is, and I think you also hit this on the head, China has been a little more conciliatory lately. Like they retired the wolf warrior guys. Like Xi Jinping said some nice things in public. They're not wearing the masks anymore. Like they're trying to find all the stuff. And it's not working. The United States isn't having it. And I guess the part that is demented to me is, the United States is kicking China's ass all over the world. It's not just on the public opinion stuff. We've got the Netherlands and Japan joining up for the semiconductor supply chain initiatives. And everybody, like China, as you say, has become toxic. So we're going to use a spy balloon incident to not send Blinken to visit China? Like I don't know.
Well, it's not enough, though. It's not enough. First of all, you had to negotiate with Japan and the Netherlands to get them on board. Mm-hmm. That happened like 4 months after the October 7th Commerce Department order. In other words, the U.S. didn't have Japan and the Netherlands. And the terms of the deal are not revealed. The Dutch themselves came out and said, like, nah, we're not going to tell you. You know why? Because they probably didn't agree to everything that is in the October 7th order. What I'm getting at is this. I'm leading off too technically. Let me bring it back. The U.S. doesn't have the allies on board with China. It just doesn't. Not fully. And I think that reveals a level of, ambivalence to the rest of the world. The foreign media is covering this balloon thing, as it should, God bless them, in a cynical, humor-filled way, because it is. And that's bothering the U.S., which is trying to create a firm coalition against China. It's failing to do that. And I think that really reveals the fact that, we are observing this issue on Twitter, in the media, you and I. We lead off our conversation about the balloon in a very binary way, like, oh, China's clumsy, America's hysterical, blah, blah, blah. But like, there's a whole other world out there. And that's, I think, the most important point here. The most important point here is that in a multipolar environment, what the US and China do doesn't matter as much. What matters is how the rest of the world perceives the two powers. And from that perspective, these hysterics are important because the US is trying to convince the rest of the world that China is evil. The balloon thing is not going to work, but there's other efforts to do that. And China is not targeting the trauma offensive on the US. And, this is something that I've been writing for all of last year, arguing that China would have to back off because a bipolar world order is negative for Beijing. They will lose. If the West unites, it's over. It's game over for China. Like the end of sentence. Yep. I don't want to hear any arguments against that. So the Chinese they launched the Charm Offensive not to placate the US. This is a very important point. They did it to not piss off the Europeans, to get the Southeast Asian countries to cool it, to feel a little bit more like China is rational. And that's why when you read the leading op-ed everywhere in the US media is like, the Trump offensive failed. I'm like, guys, it's not about you. It's not about America. Sorry. Like, China's not flirting with you. It's flirting with the rest of the world. It understands. I think Chinese policymakers have now learned enough about US domestic politics that there's nothing they can do to catch the eye of the US at the bar. It's just not going to happen.
Yeah. I'm interested in what you said about U.S. allies not being on the same page, because I don't know that the United States is going to succeed long-term in assembling an anti-China coalition, but it seems to me, at least in the first few months of this year and the last few months of last year, that they have had some success. Now, you threw some cold water on the Dutch thing, and I was shocked the Dutch even said yes in provisional ways. Like, that didn't make any sense to me. Japan's on board. There's flirtation with India, too. I put out a short piece about that last week on the CI channels about how, I mean, it's not like a trade deal or anything like that. Oh, but we're gonna do supply chains, and we're gonna accept investment, and we're gonna meet every. I don't know. There's just some little bubbling things that maybe the U.S. is attracting India a little bit. But you think it's nonsense. You don't think the U.S. is building a firm coalition.
No, there is no firm coalition. I mean, Europeans are now the largest source of FDI for China. There's polling data of European corporates that shows that none of them want to move out of China. Like Japan's economy is still tied to China. It's trying to protect itself in terms of the high-tech semiconductor supply chain, but there isn't the kind of a coalition that I think American officials are hoping for, which is a bifurcated world into two spheres. Mm-hmm. In fact, the largest source of onshoring in not just Southeast Asia, but also Latin America and even in Mexico are the Chinese. So the irony of all this is, the Americans are obsessed about friendshoring, like we got to move production out of China. Well, China's beating you to it. It's Chinese corporates that are moving their own factories to supposedly American allies for two reasons. One, they're not stupid. They're getting behind the sanctions, and two, they're like, well, actually Americans are kind of right. We are not that reliable anymore. Wages are going up. There's all this sort of common prosperity stuff. Why don't we move some of our production to Vietnam, to Mexico? And so, yeah, I would say that the type of a coalition Americans think they're going to get is just not going to happen. Now, to be clear, Jacob, if there's World War III, and I always say this, if there is World War III, the French are fighting with Americans against China. No one disputes that. No one's saying that these are not committed American allies. It's just that France is also going to go to the US and say hey, bro, remember when you stole $88 billion from me by going behind my back and selling Australia some submarines? Yeah. So I'm going to sell some Airbus airplanes to China. Sorry. All's fair in love and war. And, this is just, it doesn't mean that these are not allies. I think that too many geopolitical tourists, of which there are many today, are trying to create this binary world of ones or zeros, and it just doesn't exist. It's a nuanced world, and I think American policymakers don't understand that the rest of the world is just not going to follow them on 9 out of 10 initiatives when it comes to China.
Yes, there are geopolitical tourists, and there are also those geopolitical vagrants who are holding up signs saying the end of the world is coming and selling pencils out of a cup, who are not tourists. They're just there and will be there until the end of time. Well, I'm glad I asked about the China balloon thing, because we actually got to something that was interesting. So good on that. Sticking with the subject of war, you and I haven't talked about the latest on Russia, Ukraine, and I'm sort of curious to get your take. I'm getting increasingly more concerned that this is going to get a lot worse, sort of once we get past March, April, with both sides arming themselves to the tilt. Are you also concerned, or are you feeling a little more sanguine?
Well, directionally, I think that we have to adopt your position. It will get worse after a lull over the winter. But since, this isn't just informative, we're here to give the people what they want, which is entertainment. I'm also going to take the other side and argue it, and say that, look, I think the borders you're looking at are kind of where they are. I think this is my view. I think the Russians are going to have this offensive that everyone's flagging. They've recruited hundreds of thousands of new recruits. They're going to throw them into the meat grinder, and they're going to conquer Donbass. They're going to conquer the remaining white space, especially in the oblast of Donetsk, which they haven't been able to conquer since 2014, and it's honestly a national embarrassment, on par with anything that's ever happened bad to the Russians. Mm-hmm. So this is a pro-Russian, Russian-speaking, populated by ethnic Russians oblast, and they've been unable to conquer it. That is embarrassing. So I think that they will conquer that, declare victory, and the war will be over.
Well, Do you think is that enough for Putin? Because I mean, I can't remember when you said that Putin was only going to last 12 months, and I started parroting you a little bit there. But it seems like he's sticking around, and I don't have a good sense of if he did that. Because if he just takes Donetsk and then declares victory, in some ways that's even more humiliating than what's going on right now. It makes more sense to be like, all right, we're doing second and third mobilization. We're going to throw hundreds of thousands of people into this great, determinative conflict for the future of the Russian nation. If he's just like, yeah, we got Donetsk and we're done, like that's why we killed hundreds of thousands of people. I mean,
well, to be fair to, I guess, Moscow, they did get Luhansk.
Great.
Yeah, I know. What does the winner get? Look, they got Donbas. If he conquers the remaining territories of Donetsk, you now have Donbas. Novaya Russia is conquered. Then you have the land bridge to Crimea, which you did not have in 2014-15. So you have Zaporizhia that gets you to Crimea with a road, not a bridge. And then you have parts of Kherson, which are a buffer to Crimea and water. And by the way, when they annexed these territories, it was very interesting in the follow-up press conference when Dmitry Peskov basically clarified, like, we are annexing Donetsk and Luhansk in its totality with the borders. But when it comes to Zaporizhia and Kherson, we will let the voters decide. What he really meant, because Russia is not a lover of liberal democracy and referendums, what he really meant is like, look, Zaporizhia and Kherson, we'll take what we get based on military reality on the ground, but Donetsk and Luhansk, we need to conquer those borders. In other words, the spokesman for the Kremlin told you months ago what the kind of like the end goal is. Now, you're right, maybe at some point Vladimir Putin is going to say, well, that's not enough for me to stay in power, or this is this or that. I think for the time being, it's more than enough. It accomplishes what Russia basically wants. It takes Donbas, that becomes Russia, and then they have a path to Crimea, water for Crimea, and a buffer for Crimea. Now, I did say in early March of 2022 that he had 12 months. So I've got like 25 more days for my forecast to be correct. It's not going to be correct. But I do think that at least this way, he prevents continuous draining of Russian material resources, because that's when the West wins. The West will win if this never ends. And if Ukraine is simply a rock against which the West can break Russia and drain Russia. And so I think that finding an exit is critical to Russia. And that's why I think that, is it going to get worse? I'm not sure. I mean, yes, it has to get worse. Russians have to conquer Donetsk. But I think both sides are really exhausted, Jacob. And one thing is, I think come on your podcast before and talked about how the West is hypocritical. Like it's not really supporting Ukraine to the tilt. They didn't supply them with main battle tanks. It's something that I raised 6-8 months ago. I think somebody's finally started reading my research or my Twitter because they finally did that. Like they started finally providing. But the problem is they're doing it in like piecemeal fashion. They're going to get 14 Leopard 2s from Germany, 14 from Poland, 31 Abrams. I mean, this isn't a Hyundai. Like the Ukrainians need to learn how to use it. Tanks break down in the field a lot. You're going to need to have spare parts, supply chains. Second, without air cover, a tank is just an artillery piece on a tracked, mobility tool.
Yeah.
Like it's not an offensive tool without air cover. Without air cover, these are useless tanks. And we didn't support Ukraine with fighter jets and so on. So I think that this kind of a continuous piecemeal support for Ukraine illustrates to you what the West wants, which is that the West doesn't really want Ukraine to reconquer these territories successfully either. So I think within the next 6 months, this war is probably over. And I'm going to, let's make a bold call. There you go.
Yeah, that's bold. I mean, but I guess the other side of the bold call is they're going to get the fighter jets. Because
again, it's not enough though. See, the problem with fighter jets and tanks and all this stuff is if the West wanted Ukraine to reconquer Crimea, the West would have given this to Ukraine 12 months ago so that they can train on these jets, so they can get the spare parts for the jets, so that they can retool their airports and their whole military procurement process. If you give Ukraine 100 F-16s tomorrow, like how effective are they going to be? day after tomorrow.
Probably more effective than the Russian Air Force.
Well, no, but I just think it's going to take a long time. Look at what's happening with tanks. This is all just a PR effort, I think, Jacob. Now Chancellor Scholz can come out and say, we're giving Ukraine Leopard 2s. Bro, you're giving them 14 tanks. Time out. What are you going to do with 14 tanks? Do you know how big the front in Ukraine is? It's bigger than World War II, for God's sakes. And World War I. It's bigger than the freaking Western Front in World War I. And you're going to give them 14 tanks? That is ridiculous. And my point is that, the fighter jets is going to be the same. There's going to be like 12 F-16s from Greece. There's going to be 8 F-16s from this, for that. Like, by the time the Ukrainians have a competent air force trained on these platforms, and the time that they've kind of learned how to do command and control between these new fighter jets and the new tanks, it's going to be 2024. And by then, the Russians are going to have 500,000 troops garrisoning these new territories. And by the way, the West is fine with that. The West is perfectly fine with an outcome where Ukraine doesn't have Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson, and Crimea, and the Russians have to drain continuously their resources on ensuring that they're garrisoned with sufficient manpower to ensure that Ukraine doesn't reconquer them. Perfect! Because you know what? Nobody gives a shit about these oblasts outside of Ukraine. And God bless Ukrainians, it's their land, obviously. They're going to fight. They're never going to give it up officially. I get that. Feel them. But the point is, Berlin, Paris, Washington, D.C., Rome, Madrid, they couldn't find Zaporizhia on the map 18 months ago. So, no. To me, all of this is a PR effort, just like the embargo against Russian crude was a PR effort. It didn't contribute to Russia losing supply or the world losing Russian supply. Similarly, I think a lot of these weapon sales or transfers are designed to make nice headline covers in the New York Times, Le Monde, El País, Corriere della Sera. That's what it's designed to do. It's not designed to effectively allow Ukraine to reconquer their territories. Now, look, that's geopolitically incorrect to say. See what I did there?
I did.
But, prove to me otherwise. Prove to me that the West has actually equipped Ukraine with offensive technology in bulk and in time and in speed. Why is this happening in February of 2023? It could have happened in August of 2022. And by now, Ukrainians would have 300 main battle tanks. They would have been trained at them, and they would have potentially a fighter jet force capable of protecting their skies, which they don't.
If I had had time to do a fake ad, I would have written up a fake ad now, and it would be advertising the third movie in the Top Gun trilogy, Top Gun Ukraine, where Maverick goes to Kyiv and trains all of he trains all of them on the F-16, and he starts blowing MiGs out of the sky.
Jacob, cut this out, bro. Don't give Hollywood anything for free, man. Let's write that script. You and me write that script.
Yeah, it'll be like our version of Good Will Hunting, except with a lot more geopolitics.
The geopolitics. Cut this out of the podcast. Don't share this with the people.
But let's take your scenario then, though, because I guess I'll play devil's advocate, and then let's push your scenario a little bit. You're right that it's piecemeal, but it's trickling in, it's dribbling in. So eventually they will have a couple hundred tanks. Probably eventually they'll have some fighter jets. Is it enough? And as you said, the Ukrainians are not going to give up. So if they have to wait 6 months for all the tanks to come in, eventually they're going to have the tanks, right? So maybe.
So let's push back.
Yeah,
let's push back on that. Okay. So that's important. Yeah. So I think, look, the Russian offensive is starting tomorrow.
Yeah.
And let's not count any Russian chickens before they're hatched, because Russians have been incompetent to the nth degree. But let's assume that Russia's successful, which again, I'm very, very cautious to do, because Russians just don't know how to fight a war. Sorry, Russian trolls out there. Sorry to make you feel sad. But let's say that they conquer Donetsk, and then they plow another 500,000 troops, Jacob. Terrible, under-equipped, under-trained. They're wearing sandals in the winter, all sorts of stuff. But they will have these territories protected to the teeth. And then you're asking Ukraine with 321 tanks, which is what the Ukrainian defense ministry said they expect from the West over the course of X amount of time. 321 tanks and let's say 50 fighter jets. You're expecting that to dislodge the Russians from entrenched defensive positions in late 2023, early 2024, when the Ukrainians become trained. And I just think that's unrealistic. Ukrainians have fought heroically. They've done an amazing job. And they've proven the well-known military adage that those who defend are at an advantage. Well, guess what? When they start the offensive operations to retake these territories with 321 tanks across a front line that's bigger than anything ever fought in Europe since the Napoleonic Wars, like, you know what I mean? It's just not going to happen, man. There's just no way that Ukraine can use 320 tanks and some, like, 3 dozen fighter jets to dislodge 500,000 Russian troops from a very large piece of territory. And by the way, Russians can play defense. We just haven't seen them really play that much defense. They have air defense capabilities. They have shoulder-launched surface-to-air missiles. You know, they have all that stuff that the Ukrainians used against them. And so, yeah, I just think that this is a stalemate. Once Russians conquer what they need, I think that a Ukrainian offensive, you know, based on a patchwork of tanks they get. And by the way, like, the French are going to send Leclerc tanks. The British are sending Challengers. The Americans are sending Abrams. The Germans are sending Leopards. It's just like, come on, this is like the United Nations of a tank force. You know, what are they going to do? Like, Leclerc breaks down, they're going to get a Leopard track. Well, I mean, it just sounds terrible. I think this is all symbolic. I think the West is honestly kind of not being honest with Ukraine. And I think that it's not going to, that there's no chance for a successful Ukrainian offensive against the bulk of the territories that the Russians have.
Yeah, I'll venture a politically incorrect joke and say, it's like the LGBTQ of tanks. Like, how many? It's going to be the UK, US, F. I don't know. That's probably not a good joke, and I'll get canceled for saying it. The other part of this that I feel like I've only just been wrapping my brain around is that now that Ukraine has had as much success as they've had, Zelensky is in some ways fighting a two-front war. He's got the war against Russia, but then he's got the war against the Ukrainian oligarchs and the system that never really liked him in the first place and was the whole reason, like, the West didn't want to fund Ukraine and put all these restrictions on IMF disbursements in 2019, sort of the pre-war world. And I just wonder also if there's going to be an interest for Zelensky to keep the war going, because as long as the war is going, he's the wartime leader. And he can arrest these guys for corruption charges, or he can use that sort of state of emergency to go after the Ukrainian state in a way to try and set Ukraine on a better path going forward. Because I don't know if you have this sense. To me, if the war ended tomorrow, I'm not sure Zelensky would last that much longer. I'm pretty sure the oligarchs would just sort of reassert themselves, and that he hasn't really purged like that part of the corrupt Ukrainian state. But I don't know. I haven't really developed that idea quite enough yet. But I think you can start to see that in the corruption purges. I mean, they're talking about firing the defense minister right now, when, as you say, the Russian counter invade, like they're probably going to invade like in the next couple of weeks, and we're firing the defense minister.
You know, I'm as you're saying this, I'm looking at some of the polling that my team has collected out of Ukraine, and I think there's an inflection in Ukrainian society, and wars do this. You know, wars create these lasting revolutions. And so I'm not sure that I would be as negative. So, there's this one poll from the Kiev International Institute of Sociology. And the latest data point is July 22. And the opinion poll basically asks citizens, respondents, whether they identify themselves above all as citizens of Ukraine, as opposed to residents of their region or some other identifier. And basically what you see on this chart is that for most of Ukraine's history, only about 40% of Ukrainians felt that they were Ukrainian. Mm-hmm. After the Orange Revolution, it went up to like 50, then went back down. And now in 2014, it went from 50 to about 65%, and then from 60% to 80% during this conflict. Mm. You know, so basically, my suggestion to Ukraine is that every single city of Ukraine should have a statue to Vladimir Putin. You know, because he basically created the identity of this nation by being basically an idiot and a terrible geopolitical strategist.
Yeah.
He single-handedly handed the Ukrainians a national identity, a sense of a state. And I think Zelensky is using that very, very skillfully. I think he's done very, very well. And so I think that this, even if the war ends tomorrow, there's two things that I think Zelensky has going for him. One, there's now that sense of identity that's Ukrainian. Even I know so many Ukrainians, and almost every Ukrainian I know, by the way, Jacob, is a Russian-speaking Ukrainian.
Yep.
Right? And every single one of them is now speaking Ukrainian with their own family at home. Which is fascinating. So these are Russian-speaking Ukrainians. They never felt Russian, but they now feel compelled to be even more Ukrainian. And this is real and it's genuine. They're not doing that because they're threatened. They're doing that even in Santa Monica or wherever else. So there's that still going for him. And the second thing that I think is going for Zelensky, to your point, if the war ends tomorrow, the war will not end for Ukraine. It will end for me and you as investors. It will end for Russia. But Ukrainians will continue to have this, like, Crimea is Ukrainian. This goal, this sort of national, like, reunification goal that will drive and motivate, I think, this anti-corruption effort for a very long time. And so the anecdotals that are coming out of Ukraine are really interesting. And the anecdotals suggest that the time of corruption and this and that is just over. So I don't know if the oligarchs are going to reassert control. And this is why. Because in a time of war, in a time of emergency, the power comes from the men with guns. And there's a great line in the House of Cards. I don't know if anyone still remembers that show. Got canceled because Kevin Spacey. But there's a great line where Kevin Spacey's talking to that rich guy that was like financing him.
Yeah,
and he says
Remy, I think. So.
Yeah, he's in a barbecue like place, and the guy comes to kind of bully him. And Kevin Spacey tells him, "You may have all the money, Raymond, but I have all the men with guns." Now, in a time of peace, that doesn't really matter. The guy with the money can bribe your men with guns. But when there is a national emergency, and that will last for Ukraine a lot longer than the war will, I think that the country is on the right path. And I think that if Zelensky continues to pursue nation building, really, I think that this is very positive for Ukraine in the long term. I would say that right now, by the way, Jacob, there's two countries on the planet that are doing true nation building, like 19th century, 18th century, like style nation building. And it's Ukraine because of the war, and it's Saudi Arabia. And for Saudi Arabia, I would also say it's because of war. It's because of insecurity. It's because of geography. It's because of Iran. It's because of a slew of things. But those two countries, what they're doing, I think we're missing. We're missing the big picture here. Extremely optimistic on both countries. Now, which is funny because someone listening to this podcast, because they've been spoon-fed a steady dose of Western bullshit propaganda, probably hears my other parts when I was talking about how Ukraine has no chance to reconquer this and thinks that I'm not pro-Ukrainian. That's, who cares, first of all, whether I am or not? That's irrelevant. What I'm saying is they're not going to conquer these territories. That sucks. Too bad. Russians are going to win, as far as like Donetsk is concerned. But in the long term, Ukraine's going to win because it's going to have a country, and it's going to be a pretty functioning country, and maybe even more functioning than many EU member states that snuck in, like Romania and Bulgaria. I think what's happening in Ukraine, I think, doesn't end with the conflict.
Well, sort of. So let's accept that mode of argument then, because then let's say it goes to war is over in 6 months. Russia declares victory in Donetsk and Luhansk. They don't bomb Odessa into smithereens or do anything else crazy. So let's say that's where it ends. Where do Russia-European relations go? You still think there's a future for Europe-Russia relations and Europe's going to go back to importing Russian natural gas and all that? Or do you think that something has fundamentally changed in Europe and that Russia is going to be treated sort of like this pariah that they can pick across, and they will nation build Ukraine and then slowly, integrate Ukraine into the German-led economic model and go from there?
I think that we have to remember that Europe and Russia have had wars over the last 400 years on and off, and yet they are still there. So it depends what your time horizon is, Jacob. I think absolutely Russia will continue to be part of the European geopolitical sphere and will have improved. There will be thaws and détentes, and everyone right now who has a little Ukrainian flag next to their name on Twitter is probably losing their mind when they hear me say this. But obviously, Russia and Europe are going to have ups and downs in their relationships because that's been the case for centuries before Twitter. Now let's get specific. Will Europe buy Russian natural gas next year or this year? Sorry, this summer. I think the chances of that increase as the storage decreases. Now, natural gas storage has been filled because, as I've joked on Twitter, God hates Putin. Like God, our Lord and Savior, hates Vladimir Putin. Also hates skiers because he ruined the ski season, or she. Hey, let's be objective here. But God, the deity that rules us all, basically decided that Europe was going to have the hottest winter ever. And so European storage facilities are pretty filled. And so I don't know if Europe will need Russian natural gas. But let me say this. If Russia declares victory and then signals hey, we're done, cool it, and Europeans need natural gas, if those two things happen, then yes, I do think they will get some Russian natural gas. Now, there's going to be a bunch of people who are geopolitical macro tourists who are going to shake their little fist and say, but Marko, that means they're going to undo all of the diversification efforts from Russia, to which I will say that's idiotic. Of course not. They're still diversifying away from Russia, but in the interim, you may want to lower your cost of natural gas by importing some natural gas from Russia. So you can chew gum and walk at the same time. You can do both. And so, I think that there is a scenario where in 2023, natural gas prices start going back up, and Europe is the war in Ukraine is simmering. It's on the back burner. Let's get some of this Russian natural gas. And again, this is why the Europeans have not embargoed natural gas at any point. Now, they haven't even talked about it.
Do you think that there's a path for Ukraine to NATO or the European Union, or is that pie in the sky?
I think European Union, absolutely. Yeah. I think for European Union, for sure. For NATO, I think no. I don't think that's going to happen. And NATO has certain rules for admission into the membership, which are kind of loose rules. They're not hard rules, but one of them is you should not have territorial disputes with other countries, specifically with nuclear states, because what that means is that the moment you enter NATO, you are at war, and all the other member states have to defend you. So I don't see Ukraine ever joining NATO. Look, Finland can't join NATO because Turkey doesn't like something the Helsinki and Stockholm are doing with the Kurds. You know what I mean? The number of vetoes would be massive. And I think that we forget that the accession process requires unanimity. One country can basically veto expansion of NATO into Ukraine. So I don't think that Ukraine will ever join NATO. I also don't think that that's really relevant for Ukraine. What's relevant for Ukraine is economic development, and that comes with EU membership. Now, there's a lot of EU haters out there, but you can clearly see that every single country in Eastern Europe that joined the EU is better off than their neighbors that didn't. Yeah. That's just a fact. Being on the outside of the European Union has not worked for Central and Eastern European member states.
Yeah, I can't argue with that. I got this question at an event I did 2 weeks ago. Somebody asked me how long Erdogan could keep Finland and Sweden out of NATO, and I hadn't thought about it, so I had to reply off the cuff. I don't know, not that long. Do you think Turkey can really gum it up here and prevent Finland and Sweden from getting in?
Well, I think that one thing that we have to understand that countries like Turkey or countries like Saudi Arabia have learned how to apply pressure on the West. Saudi Arabia has done that maybe better than anyone else, and they're getting things from the U.S. in return. The media in the U.S. writes these angry op-eds about how the Saudis have become allied with Russia and China, which is nonsense. No, they're just bargaining. Turkey's bargaining as well. So, I think your answer is probably correct. Now, the Americans are trying to play hardball with Turkey. So there's this F-16 issue that's come up. Turkey needs to modernize its, I think, 80 F-16s that it owns. It wants updated electronics, avionics packages, and also wants to buy a few other ones. Now, Congress is saying to Biden, we're going to stall that until the Turks accept Sweden and Finland into NATO. That's very dangerous, I think, for the US to do, because other countries produce fighter jets, you know? Like, I don't know if America has noticed that, but other countries also make fighter jets since really like 45, 46, long time ago. And Erdogan made that point. He was like, well, then I'll just buy somebody else's, including Chinese and Russian options, by the way.
Yeah. Or South Koreans.
Yeah, exactly. So I think Turkey is going to want a slew of things. And this is their one moment, by the way. They, like from an objective, realist perspective, they should push as much as they can. So I don't know what the answer to your question is. I don't know what the shopping list for Turkey is. If I had a little bit more color into what it is they want, which obviously isn't just for Stockholm and Helsinki to crack down on, members of the PKK who might be there. I don't think that's what they really want. I think there's a shopping list that Turkey wants from the West. If we knew what it was, Jacob, I think we could answer your question better. And I think they'll get every single item on that shopping list.
Doesn't that mean, I think it was Macron who said NATO is brain dead. If they get everything on the shopping list, should we agree with Mr. Macron?
No, I don't think so. Why shouldn't the Turks get what they want in exchange for this strategic enlargement of the Western alliance?
Because 8 months before the Russia-Ukraine war, Turkish naval ships were locking onto French frigates in the Mediterranean and telling them to get the hell out of Libya and to support their side of the Libyan conflict. Like they're doing their own things. Like the Europeans should remember what happens when Turkey gets strong.
Yeah, I guess that's a good point. I guess we have to weigh how much does the West want Finland and Sweden in NATO. But I just think that this is the kind of the world we live in right now, and you sometimes just have to take, there's costs to pursuing your interests, and bullying countries the size of Turkey becomes really difficult in a multipolar context. And I guess that's kind of what I see.
Before we get to Kyrie, you mentioned India before we got on the call. What's on your mind about India? I know there's the Adani Group short report out there. I was looking at the Indian budget this week and very interested in that. I feel like on this podcast, you and I have taken opposite positions on India at least 3 or 4 different times. So why don't we just confuse the listeners and roll out whatever is thinking right now? Because I honestly can't stay consistent about India. It depends what I've had for breakfast that morning. Where are you at right now?
Well, I've been consistently bearish in India for 3 years, which has been consistently wrong. It's the best performing market in the world since COVID.
Yeah.
And then, the bottom fell out over the last month. And the bottom fell out because a research group, that's a bottom-up research group called Hindenburg, which is, by the way, the best name ever for a research firm that shorts companies.
Yeah, it is.
Just based on that, I hope people buy the research.
Although maybe they should find out the name of the Chinese spy balloon and start a product that is whatever the name of the Chinese spy balloon is.
That's right. Yeah. But yeah, so I think they wrote a piece that's very focused on the one single company. Now, I don't know anything about how to do bottom-up research on a single equity name. That's not what I do. I'm a macro investor. And so my view is that while Hindenburg is going to take a lot of credit for basically breaking India, I think it was kind of the straw that broke the back. And there was a lot of things going against India. Once China started stimulating, once China basically signaled that it was going to do pro-growth policies from now on, and not just zero COVID, but it also had to do with ending the crackdown against the TMT sector, real estate policies, and so on. Once that happened, you have commodities putting in the bottom, especially copper and other metals. Oil is probably close behind that. And suddenly, the recession narrative, which I always thought was idiotic, is becoming much more of a soft landing narrative. These are problems for India because India is the anti-growth market. It's where you hide when growth is scarce. And I also think a lot of institutional allocators who manage hundreds, of billions of dollars, they basically left China in 2021 because of the TMT sector crackdown. And then in 2022, the common prosperity theme, the geopolitics, the zero COVID, there a lot of CIOs basically went from China and allocated that EM allocation to India. So India's been basically just growing and growing and growing based on, factors that are not based on fundamentals. And in 2021 in particular, if you look at the chart of Indian equities relative to commodity performance, it's extraordinary. It's like the first time in decades that Indian assets outperformed even as commodities were going up. In 2022, commodities all obviously came down. India got another leg up. And now I think they're just coming to the end of this virtuous cycle. And it's happening because the anti-growth market should suffer in a period of decent growth. Also, I think China is starting to behave more rationally, and a lot of those CIOs who made a decision that China was not investable are dipping their toes back in, which is sufficient to kind of like create an exodus out of India. On a big picture, to me, India has got a lot of great things going for it, but I think that a lot of narratives in the West in particular are wrong. Mm-hmm. Demographics can be a curse. You got a lot of people, if you can't employ them, you've got a problem. You get the Arab Spring. So that's the first. The second is onshoring, reshoring. I haven't found any evidence other than anecdotal that it's happening. So the macro data does not support the argument that onshoring is happening in India. It's happening piecemeal fashion. And the third issue, which is the most important, is infrastructure build-out. India has a problem in that gross fixed asset investment has remained very, 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 very tepid. And more than that, most of the investment, most of the FDI goes into the service sector, which makes sense, right? Like India is known as the IT outsourcing, capital of the world, but it doesn't go into manufacturing. And this is a problem for a country that's going to try to employ all these new young people. You can't just put everyone into a service center. You should put somebody on the assembly line. So I think that India has these headwinds against it. And the final one also is that some of the Modi's reforms stalled before they were enacted because of protest. He backtracked. All of this is now coming to a head. And I think the Hindenburg guys, I'm not sure that they even realized how impactful their report is going to be, because while they focused on a single company that I have nothing to say about and don't want to get sued, by the way, cousin Jacob, let's not get sued by the richest man in the world. So okay. I will say nothing about that report. But my point is just, look, there's a lot of other things going on. And I think the pendulum is now swinging wildly away from India.
On the onshoring to India thing, the only thing I can add to you the only thing I can share is that I think that there are companies out there that want to get out of China, that want to reduce their exposure to China. And they're casting about looking for markets that they can go to. And I think they generally land on some mix of Brazil, Mexico, India, maybe Indonesia, if you're particularly adventurous. And when they start doing the cost-benefit analysis, none of them look particularly good or appetizing, especially what they were used to in China. And India is usually the one that looks the best, which is not to say that it looks good. It looks terrible. And there's so many, there's corruption issues and there's fixed capital formation. Like there's so much stuff that has to happen there. And usually I think you probably conclude that maybe we should stick in China for a little while longer. But I do think that people are trying to find that market out there. And in some ways that's opportunities for countries that want to ascend the value chain. There are no good options of scale that have all the things that China did. So if you are a developing country and you're some bureaucrat in a developing country's, Center for Economic Development, I would say just take the China blueprint, get your president to implement it, and you will have Western companies that are knocking on your door, because there's certainly interest for that sort of thing.
The two things that I rely on, first of all, is polling of corporates. There's a lot of reports out there you can find. European Chamber of Commerce in China is one of them, but there's many others. And they show that the majority of companies don't want to move out of China. And then some geopolitical macro tourist is going to say well, they'll get their comeuppance. Sure, fine, whatever. Maybe not. I don't think so, but let's move on. The second is just macro data. And I can assure you this is clear. Now, macro data is backward looking, so maybe we'll see what happens in 5 years. But so far, we've had COVID, We've had a trade war with China. We've had U.S. president accusing China of doing all sorts of things. We've had a confrontation with China for a good 4 or 5 years. The macro data out of India is clear. The trade is exploding because everyone's trade exploded. But their exports as percent of share of global has not gone up. So it's all beta. It's not alpha. They're not eating into anybody's market share. Whereas Vietnam is, as an example. And I think the problem with this is that I think most Westerners would want Mexico and India to win because they're on our side. But the problem is that the two of them also have the biggest infrastructure problems, bottlenecks, and concerns. In Mexico, it's energy, it's electricity. In India, it's just lack of infrastructure investment. And so that's where it gets really difficult. I probably would say that Indonesia has the most potential in the long term, although it is obviously the most in need of development. I also think that we should look beyond the usual suspects. There's parts of the supply chain that can be moved to interesting new countries. Like Saudi Arabian industrialization is breakneck speed. And I know you wouldn't think of Saudi Arabia, but what they're doing is, they're just throwing so much money at it that they're going to be, I think, carving some of this onshoring. Some of that is going to be, like, they're going to capture some of it. I think Turkey also actually has potential to capture some of it as well, especially for the European market. So I don't know if India becomes the winner.
Yeah, the big name that I was looking at before their civil war was Ethiopia, and now that they've put the genie back in the bottle a little bit, and that government seems to have control a little bit more over the situation, I'm debating whether to get optimistic about Ethiopia again too, because they're again one of the only. There are very few countries out there that have the level of scale and law and order and low labor costs that you actually need to make it work. And all the countries you mentioned have problems of their own. All right, we have a few minutes before I got to run. Kyrie Irving, tell me what's up, man. I can't believe somebody traded anything for him, let alone 2 actual human beings and a couple draft picks that will also be human beings.
So I think on paper, great fit. Because first of all, Luka Doncic is a younger version of LeBron. And
no, he's not.
Well,
no.
Well, like he plays like LeBron.
No, he doesn't.
Well, he's a 3 who handles the ball a lot
and doesn't really guard anyone.
Okay, yes, fair. Look, but the point is that he can't play with a point guard. Yeah. And that's what I mean. Like LeBron James never needed a point guard in his life because he is the point forward. In that way, it's really hard to pair Luka with a guard, especially in today's NBA where every guard wants to handle the ball. Kyrie doesn't. He really doesn't. He's a great off-the-ball 2 guard. He actually enjoys doing that. So it just makes a lot of sense basketball-wise. The problem that I have is the culture fit. Like Kyrie Irving deferred to pretty much no one, including LeBron James. He wanted out of Cleveland, if we now remember the history, because he didn't want to defer to LeBron, didn't want to be his little brother. And then now he's okay with it because he's kind of looked back fondly at that time. But the problem is that he's not going to look at Luka and say oh no, I'm cool being a little brother to Luka Doncic. And so I think the culture fit here is a big problem. I don't know how that's going to work.
Well, apparently, according to ESPN, Luka got a heads up about this, and apparently he or his camp or whatever gave the thumbs up on Kyrie, which is that either they already know they're leaving Dallas whenever they next can, or somebody said yes for him that didn't mean to. I can't imagine that he was on board with this. You think he's on board with this?
Look, I don't think it matters whether he's on board with it or not, because I think it comes down to Kyrie Irving, who's very volatile, and he's shown that he can, that his volatility can cause distraction. And look, the reports out of Dallas are that Luka controls the stereo. You know what I mean? The locker room. Yeah. There was this cute interview with, I think, Dinwiddie, where he was yeah, he plays the Slovenian pop music, and it wasn't a joke. Dinwiddie was miffed about that. And that's him. That's Dinwiddie.
Yeah.
Now you're asking Kyrie Irving to go in there. You've got this very eclectic team that's basically a EuroLeague team. Luka's got his little Euro fans around him, Maxi Kleber and the others, and Kyrie's going to show up in there, and he's going to be like, what the hell is going on here? And he's going to be like, I'm a veteran. I want a ring, which, truth, I shot a 3 in Kevin Love's face, Game 7. What have you done? So no, I control the stereo. So
no, it wasn't. It wasn't Kevin Love's face. It was who did he? Because Kevin Love was on his team.
Oh, sorry, he was on the team. My bad. No, Steph Curry tried, and then Kevin Love actually did a good job. No, it was in Steph's face, I think.
Yeah, sometimes I've been playing more pickup lately, and when I used to play pickup, my hair was blonder, and they used to call me Larry. Now apparently I look like Kevin Love, so nobody bothers to learn my name. They just call me Kevin Love, which is to say I'm up to date on my Kevin Love trivia.
That's awesome.
I don't know. I can't believe, I don't understand why any team would trade for this dude. This dude is like literally insane, and like it's going to take him 2 weeks to be sad, and then he's going to be doing his next thing. So,
and also the contract issue is interesting.
Yeah.
Like what do you do? What do you do? Like if he walks? But look, I'm a Laker fan, as everybody knows. So like,
did you want?
Well, let's put a pin on that. Because what I was going to say is, if this goes really bad, really bad, like I think Luka would look great in purple and gold. Oh wait, sorry, I lost you. I think I said something so egregiously ridiculous that we lost your sound. Nope, I still can't hear you. Is that it? We're just going to end on my prediction?
No, you're right. I accidentally hit the mute button. Apparently, the universe didn't want me to say anything. So I guess he is going to purple and gold.
No, that's because there's a conspiracy, and Lakers control your microphone, obviously. And clearly, we are going to get Luka.
I think Kyrie knows who's controlling the microphones in this relationship, Marko.
And you said it, man. You went there, and you're allowed to. So there you go.
I don't know.
By the way, that's a whole other thing. You've got a guy who has these views, and he's going to play now on a team full of like Euros. I mean, just like, I can't wait to see how this goes. This is like, I joked on Twitter, this is like Trump going to his first G7 and having to deal with Angela Merkel and like, the Italians, the Brits, the Japanese. This is going to be really, really interesting. Now, there is a world in which Kyrie is just a misunderstood counterculture man with really complicated and complex views. Mm-hmm. And so he might be actually the best fit for a weird cultural mix that is the Dallas Mavericks. I just don't know if that is the truth. And I'm open to seeing how it works out. And, like, I love Luka. I think he's awesome. So I wish them the best.
Well, on that note, I got to get out of here. But Marko, we'll have you back on soon. I was thinking we might even live record like a good playoff game or something and talk geopolitics while we're like
that would be sick.
Yeah,
I would love that.
Cousin cast or something. I'm working on that.
Yes. Let's figure out how to do that.
All right, I will. In the meantime, cheers, man.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you so much for listening to the Cognitive Dissidence podcast, brought to you by Cognitive Investments. If you are interested in learning more about cognitive investments, you can check us out online at cognitive.investments. That's cognitive.investments. You can also write to me directly if you want at jacob@cognitive.investments. Cheers, and we'll see you out there. The views expressed in this commentary are subject to change based on market and other conditions. This podcast may contain certain statements that may be deemed forward-looking statements. Please note that any such statements are not guarantees of any future performance, and actual results or developments may differ materially from those projected. Any projections, market outlooks, or estimates are based upon certain assumptions and should not be construed as indicative of actual events that will occur.